So yesterday, I talked a little bit about the situation in the Arizona State Senate and their censure of an individual named Wendy Rogers, who was censured for threats of physical violence that she made directed at Democrats and others whom she considers to be her enemies in both state government positions and in the general population. And her defense of her attending this neo-stupid fascist rally in which Vladimir Putin was praised as an authoritarian strongman, equivalent to the new Hitler, and Hitler and his project of racial extermination and the ideology of some kind of pure master race was also praised at this rally that was also attended by Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar, another Arizona Republican, who presumably all, fall in line with this ideology of racial terrorism. And to my knowledge, only Wendy Rogers was censured for her comments and participation in this, what amounts to a kind of Klan, KKK, or neo-Nazi event. And I had used this incident as an example of my concern, which I formulated and narrated as beginning around 2012 and steadily growing into the present, in which I had articulated and argued this position that neo-stupid fascism is a growing concern in the United States and a real and material and social and political threat to our democratic system, way of life, and our world and our lives, in fact, our very lives. And I had also narrated that the initial responses to my communication of these concerns, resulted in responses, very variable responses, but largely, we're not concerned that the democratic sky is falling, Chicken Little, and that some of those responses had changed, as these concerns seem to manifest themselves in ways that were more accessible to the media and the general public over the course of the years towards the present. And by 2019 at least, people were recognizing the threat, but often saying, yes, but what can we do about it, right? So I thought of this Paul Tillich quote, and I'll read it briefly. He who risks and fails can be forgiven. And Paul Tillich is a Christian in the line of socialist Christians that believed in the principles in the gospel and the virtues and the ideas that this figure of Christ professed, that more or less, that in a similar way that I read the gospel, the Sermon on the Mount being a kind of gospel of compassion, right, and of helping others, and of attempting to eliminate violence from oneself and the world. And so it's coming from that perspective. He who risks and fails can be forgiven. He who never risks and never fails is a failure in his whole being. And I thought about this quote, and I thought about its relationship to fascism, and how fascism is so unforgiving, and how it seems to me that one of the fundamental principles of fascism is to see certain kinds of beings as errors in and of themselves, and to be unforgiving about a certain kind of human failure, or a certain kind of human difference, and that isn't even failure. To want to erase, right? And as someone with a writing disability who makes errors rather continuously, right? I've seen the way that sorting mechanisms in the educational process, in certain ways, mirror or reflect this unforgivingness, right? So you can never really get through a sentence because you have to go back and erase so many times, or that word's not spelled correctly, and so your ideas must not be of any value. I narrated a story about my uncle that who refused to recognize my intelligence because all he saw were spelling errors and a difficulty, a real physical difficulty that I had in writing, especially writing by hand, and yet I have continued to struggle and managed to teach myself how to read, not so much by recognizing words as a string or series of letters, but recognizing each word holistically as a shape, and I managed to suffer through what for me is a very painful process of writing by hand, and attend college and do various things, and make these errors, and also put up with the forms of social disparagement and belittling that goes along with making errors and taking the risk of presenting information that that they're there, and you do the best that you can to eliminate the majority of the errors. But for me, that the writing process is so difficult, just like it for a dyslexic. Reading, the decoding and the deciphering process requires so much conscious attention that the underlying purpose for the reading, to understand what is being said and written, gets lost in the process of the decoding, and that's the way that I experience writing. But I do it nevertheless, and take those risks, and accept that there will be a certain amount of social disparagement and humiliation, right, following all of that. And I imagine that this is part of what was given to me as my process of self-understanding, and the gift in some way of being able to maintain, compassion and the drive and motivation to write about what I feel I need to write about, understanding that there will be, this basically assault on me and what I do. But in any case, I had thought about, how both, in educational sorting, there's this unforgiveness, and then in fascism, this failure to recognize anything other than what it sees as itself, and certainly unforgiving, and how this idea of perfection and purity that exists in fascism, this myth of this and this ideal of this false ideology of perfection and purity is so unforgiving and is so destructive and violent, and the way that it plays itself out in a certain way in this piece that I had done, sorting by fascism, and I thought it was interesting that this quote occurred to me yesterday as I was narrating this story about this Wendy Rogers, and how eager she was to condemn and throw into the fire all of these individuals, and hang, threaten to hang all of these individuals who are different from her, but manages to somehow ignore and fail to recognize her own errors and failures, and not take responsibility. And it occurred to me that Trump is another one that systematically refuses to recognize that he's ever made a mistake. I remember seeing once in an interview, he was asked if he ever prayed for forgiveness, since he espouses to be a Christian. I sincerely doubt that he has ever read anything of the Christian gospel, or that he understands anything of the principles of what really make this at least in the early at least in the early history of Christianity, what really make it a social and ethical project. But nevertheless, he espouses these values, which I'm sure that he doesn't have. But he was asked, if he ever prayed for forgiveness, or asked for guidance, and he said no. I never do, because I never have anything to be forgiven for. I move on. And it seemed to me like it was a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of forgiveness itself, and this refusal, this fascist refusal to recognize that in error there's not necessarily an absolute wrong, but error itself can become a process for learning. And I find that especially with my the mistakes that I make in spelling and dysgraphia, or even in remembering a date, that if I'm driven to look it up, I discover something and I learn something. And so failure can be a way of sorting. You made a mistake, and so you get sorted into the pile where we're going to burn you on the pyre, right? But failure can also be recognized as, if you make a lot of mistakes, you have a lot of places to begin looking for new and interesting information. And it occurred to me that, when I was thinking about this quote by Paul Tillich, that, for some reason, when I performed this activity of sorting by fascism, that I had placed Paul Tillich's writing. I think it was this book. It may have been a different book. I'm not entirely certain, but I believe that it was The New Being. But I had placed it into the pile scot-free, when in fact it clearly, right, should have been placed in the pile death row, because Paul Tillich's ideas, were not only ideologically and structurally incompatible with fascism, but began, in some ways as a response, to the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany and his alternative of socialism and humanitarian justice as an articulation of faith. So that error in sorting, it seemed to me, was in some ways a failure or a mistake, and required an emendation. It required going back and admitting, to the error. First of all, saying, making kind of confession. For some reason, unbeknownst to me, I threw the Tillich into the scot-free pile, which was clearly a sorting error under fascism, because fascism would have sorted all of the volumes of Paul Tillich into the death row pile, and so not recognizing the mistake and saying, I refuse to claim responsibility for the mistake and the error, and I refuse to go back and address it, would have been a very, like Trumpy thing to do, it seems to me. And this is what perfection and the drive toward perfection and purity always is. It's always a fantasy, because there is no such thing as perfection, right? And sorting is always a fantasy of hierarchy, because there really is no hierarchy, because individuals have individual talents and abilities. Now, whether society has found ways of using them or not, that's really a failure of society's imagination, or the structural imaginary, rather than of the individual. And some of individuals appear more economically useful than others, but that's a result of accidents of the way that the structures of society have been articulated. So it seems to me that if I wanted to parody, fascism, further, I would, have left the errors as is, and there may be other errors that we need to return to and look in that sorting process. But it seems to me that that Tillich's work, clearly under fascism would be sorted into, like some of the other volumes that I had sorted into the death row pile. So I wanted to make that emendation today, and to do so in honor of Wendy Rogers, who doesn't make these kinds of sorting errors, and President, former neo stupid fascist President Donald Trump, who also doesn't make such errors, and therefore has nothing to be forgiven for, who just moves on, and can be so sure of his lack of mistakes. And the real danger, right, in not recognizing your error, is that it never leaves, right? You continue to promote it, beyond beyond the beyond the obvious evidence that's presented before your eyes. And I have no doubt that Trump will never admit that he lost a general presidential election, and he will never admit that he failed. Right? He failed to win the 2020 presidential race, the election, and his inability to admit failure, and his inability to recognize himself as anything other than perfect, and the pleasure that he takes in the verbal violence and physical threats that he makes on individuals who even suggest that he can fail or can create an error is, in fact, a form of the fascist psychology and sadism that very much belongs to the core of his psychological self-understanding, or lack of self-understanding, his way of operating in the world. And so at the core of his psychological being, he is unable to see himself as a human being capable of failure. He's only capable of seeing himself as an embodiment of this kind of supreme perfection and an entity that is separate from those beneath him, and the way that this separation is assured is by eliminating, anyone who doesn't support and recognize it, right? In the same way that Putin's invasion and destruction of the Ukraine is violence in and of itself, and a destruction of all opposition, and this is the very basis of the fascist personality type. This and the idea that any criticism is coming from a malevolent entity, not of a personal failure. Because the Supreme Being never fails, and never fails because he cannot. And therefore will never admit to such failure. You can't even begin to learn if you can't admit to failure. So the ignorance in the fascist personality is so deeply ingrained that that real intellectual learning, understanding, and development is impossible. So I'm really glad that I made that error in sorting this volume, because I never would have considered all of these issues if I hadn't re-examined some of the ideas, beginning with this quotation from Paul Tillich.